The polished marble floor of the Hotel Serafina reflected the chandelier like a galaxy of captured stars. It was a Tuesday night, which meant the lobby was a quiet, humming machine of discreet wealth and practiced indifference. Reina, from her post behind the sweeping mahogany front desk, was the machine's operator. At 21, she possessed a preternatural calm that could soothe the most irate trust fund heir and an eye for detail that caught smudges on glass from 50 feet away. Her uniform, a tailored black blazer and skirt, was immaculate, her name tag, Reina, gleaming under the soft lights. She ran the desk not just with competence, but with an authority that belied her years, an authority born of knowing the rules, so well she could wield them like a shield. Tonight, however, a discordant note had entered the symphony. A man, slumped in one of the velvet armchairs near the grand central fountain, was the source. His suit was a rumpled masterpiece of charcoal wool that probably cost more than her car, but his tie was askew, and a lock of dark hair had fallen across his brow. He was muttering to himself, his voice a low growl that disturbed the hushed atmosphere. Guests gave him a wide berth, their curiosity veiled by polite avoidance. Reina watched him for precisely 7 minutes, the time allotted by hotel policy before intervention was required. When he swayed to his feet and nearly stumbled into the fountain's basin, she knew the moment had come. She rounded the desk, her sensible heels making soft, determined clicks on the floor. Her manager, Mr. Davies, caught her eye from across the lobby, his expression a frantic plea for her to do nothing. Reina ignored him. Policy was policy. It was the bedrock that kept this place from descending into chaos. As she approached, the scent hit her. Expensive whiskey and something else, something cold and sharp like ozone after a storm. "Sir," she said, her voice even and clear. It was the voice she used for lost luggage and mistaken room charges. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The man turned his head slowly. In the dim light, his features were sharp, carved from stone. His eyes, dark and deep-set, struggled to focus on her. For a moment, they were just the bleary eyes of a drunk, but then they cleared, just for a second, and a flash of stunning, chilling intelligence looked out at her. He said nothing. He just stared, taking in her full-figured frame, her neatly braided hair, the unapologetic set of her jaw. "You've had too much to drink, sir," Reina continued, unintimidated. She had dealt with bigger men, angrier men, men who thought their money bought them the right to be belligerent. "This is a private establishment. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone causing a disturbance." A low, humorless sound escaped his lips. It wasn't a laugh. It was the sound of grinding stone. He took a step toward her, and the sheer force of his presence, even drunk, was like a physical blow. He was taller than she'd realized, his frame lean but powerful under the expensive fabric. Still, she held her ground. "Do you know who I am?" he finally rasped, his voice a gravelly baritone. "You're a guest who is violating hotel policy," Reina replied without missing a beat. She lifted her hand, signaling the 2 security guards who had been hovering nervously by the entrance. "And you're being escorted from the premises."
"Now."
The guards, both large men, hesitated. They looked from Reina to the man, then to Mr. Davies, who was now sweating profusely and making frantic cutting motions with his hand. Reina's gaze was flint. She was in charge of this lobby. She would not have her authority undermined. "Now," she repeated, her tone dropping half an octave. That single word seemed to break the spell. The guards moved, flanking the man. To her surprise, he didn't resist. He allowed them to take his arms, but his eyes never left hers. As they guided him toward the revolving glass doors, the look he gave her was no longer drunk. It was cold, sharp, and appraising. It was the look of a predator cataloging its prey. It promised consequences. Reina felt a shiver trace its way down her spine, a cold premonition that she had just made a mistake of catastrophic proportions. But she lifted her chin, turned on her heel, and walked back to the sanctuary of her desk, the absolute silence of the entire lobby following her every step. The next morning, Mr. Davies summoned her to his office. The room was opulent, with dark wood paneling and a view of the city, but today it felt like a funeral parlor. He sat behind his massive desk, his face the color of old parchment. He couldn't seem to meet her eyes. "Reina," he began, his voice thin and reedy, "do you have any idea what you did last night?" "I enforced hotel policy regarding an intoxicated and disruptive individual," she said, her own voice betraying none of the anxiety gnawing in her stomach. She had replayed the incident in her head all morning. She had been professional, firm, and correct. Mr. Davies let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. An intoxicated individual? He finally looked up, his eyes wide with terror. Reina, that was Kwon Jinwoo. The name meant nothing to her. She tilted her head, waiting. "Mr. Kwon," he clarified, leaning forward as if sharing a state secret. "The owner. He owns this hotel. He owns all the Serafina hotels. He owns the land they're built on, and half the businesses on this block. He owns, well, from what I hear, he owns a great deal of this city's nightlife, legal and otherwise." The cold premonition from the night before solidified into a block of ice in her chest. She had thrown the king out of his own castle. She thought of the look in his eyes as they'd led him away, the sudden, terrifying clarity. She braced herself, preparing her resignation speech. It was better to leave on her own terms than to be unceremoniously fired. "I see," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "He called this morning," Mr. Davies whispered, wringing his hands. "Or rather, his assistant did. I was sure. I was certain he was going to demand your immediate termination. I was preparing your severance." Reina waited for the inevitable conclusion, but it didn't come. "The message was 2 words," her manager said, looking utterly bewildered. "She stays." The reprieve felt less like a relief and more like a threat. Why would he keep her? To make an example of her? To torment her? The uncertainty was worse than being fired. She returned to her duties, a sense of dread clinging to her like a second skin. The day passed in a blur of check-ins and concierge calls. When her night shift began, the lobby felt different, charged with a new tension. The staff spoke to her in whispers, their eyes a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. At exactly 11 o'clock, a sleek black sedan, so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it, purred to a stop at the hotel's entrance. The valet practically tripped over himself to open the door. Kwon Jinwoo emerged. Tonight, he was the picture of lethal elegance. A tailored black suit clung to his shoulders, a crisp white shirt stark against his tan skin. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his eyes, when they swept the lobby, were completely sober and utterly cold. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't approach the desk. His gaze found her immediately, pinning her in place. Then, with a deliberate, unhurried grace, he crossed the marble floor to the same armchair he had occupied the night before. He sat down, crossed one leg over the other, and fixed his eyes on her. And he watched. Thus began the siege. Every night he was there, an immaculate, silent sentinel in a $1,000 suit. He would arrive at 11 and leave just before her shift ended at 7 in the morning. He never ordered a drink. He never read a book or looked at his phone. His sole occupation was observing her. The weight of his stare was a physical thing, pressing on her skin, raising the hairs on her arms. It was a calculated form of psychological warfare, and it was brutally effective. Reina, in response, became a fortress of professionalism. She answered every call with perfect diction. She greeted every guest with a serene smile. She resolved a billing error for a German diplomat and arranged a last-minute helicopter tour for a tech billionaire, all while the most dangerous man in the city watched her every move. She refused to let him see her crack. She poured all her focus into the minutiae of her job, finding a strange comfort in the familiar rhythms of her work. But in the quiet moments, when the lobby was empty, she would allow herself to study him back. She learned the subtle tells of his mood. A slight tightening of his jaw meant he was displeased with something one of his men, who now stood like statues near the entrance, whispered to him. The way his long fingers would tap a silent rhythm on the arm of the chair meant he was impatient. She noticed the single, heavy silver ring he wore on his right pinky, and the faint, pale scar that cut through his left eyebrow. She learned the scent of his cologne, a clean, sharp fragrance of cedarwood and something metallic, like cold steel. She was studying a predator in his natural habitat, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he was doing the same to her. This wasn't punishment. This was something else. This was assessment. He was taking her apart piece by piece with his eyes, trying to understand what made her tick, trying to find the fear he knew should be there. Reina was determined he would never find it. The lobby of the Hotel Serafina had become their battlefield, a silent war waged across a landscape of polished marble and hushed whispers. And neither of them was willing to retreat. The silent war of attrition continued for 3 weeks. Kwon Jinwoo remained a fixed point in her nightly universe, a dark star around which her world was forced to orbit. The hotel staff had settled into a new, nervous normal, treating Reina with a cautious reverence, as if she were some strange holy relic or an unexploded bomb. She felt utterly isolated, trapped in the gilded cage of a silent scrutiny. Her life outside the hotel began to feel thin and unreal. How could she complain about rising rent or a missed bus when her nights were spent under the gaze of a man who moved with the chilling certainty of a shark? One Thursday, the fragile peace of their stalemate was broken. A group of 5 men swaggered into the lobby just after 2 a.m., and they were loud, their suits ill-fitting, their laughter echoing with false bravado. They weren't guests. They were trouble. Reina's internal alarms began to sound. Their leader, a beefy man with a face like a clenched fist, stopped at the desk. He leaned over, invading her space, his breath sour with cheap liquor. Well, he sneered, his eyes roaming over her body in a way that made her skin crawl. Look what we have here. You the welcoming committee, sweetheart. Reina's expression didn't change. She placed her hands flat on the counter, a small, grounding gesture. Welcome to the Serafina, she said, her voice a cool sheet of ice. How may I help you? You can start by telling me which floor the party's on, he said, winking at his friends. And maybe you can bring the drinks up yourself. I'm afraid I don't have any information on a party, she replied evenly. If you are not guests, I must ask you to leave. The man's face darkened. Is that right? Little girl in a uniform thinks she can give me orders. He reached across the counter, his hand aiming for her arm. He never made it. A shadow fell over them. Reina hadn't even seen Kwon Jinwoo move. One moment he was in his chair across the lobby, the next he was standing beside the man, a specter of silent menace. He didn't touch the man. He didn't have to. His proximity was enough. The temperature in the lobby seemed to drop by 20 degrees. There seems to be a misunderstanding, Kwon said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, yet it cut through the air like a razor. The loud man froze, his hand hovering in the air. He slowly turned, and his bravado evaporated, replaced by a pasty, slack-jawed fear. He recognized Kwon Jinwoo. Kwon spoke to him in Korean. The words were low and guttural, each one landing like a physical blow. Reina couldn't understand them, but she understood the tone. It was the sound of a death sentence being passed. The man began to tremble, stammering a reply, his eyes darting around for an escape. Kwon listened, his expression impassive, and then he said one final, soft word. The man and his crew turned and practically fled the hotel, stumbling over each other in their haste to get away. The lobby was once again silent. Kwon's personal guards materialized, melting back into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared. He stood there for a long moment, his back to her. Then he turned. His eyes met hers across the short distance, and the cold mask was gone. In its place was a raw, unfiltered fury. But it wasn't directed at her. It was a possessive, protective rage that was somehow more terrifying than his coldness. It was the look of a king whose territory had been violated. And she was, inexplicably, the territory in question. He held her gaze for a heartbeat longer, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, before he returned to his chair, and the familiar silence descended once more. But everything had changed. He wasn't just watching her anymore. He was guarding her. That incident marked a shift. The danger she had only sensed before was now tangible. She started seeing news reports of escalating tensions between rival criminal organizations, turf wars erupting in the city's underbelly. The number of dark-suited men in the lobby doubled. The hotel, once a sanctuary of calm, now felt like the heavily fortified embassy of a sovereign nation at war. And she was trapped in the throne room. A month to the day after she had thrown him out, he arrived looking different. The impeccable suit was still there, the posture still rigid, but the control in his eyes was frayed at the edges. A deep, profound grief radiated from him, so potent she could feel it from across the lobby. He wasn't drunk, but he looked haunted, as if wrestling with a ghost only he could see. He stared at the fountain, his gaze fixed on the cascading water, lost in a memory that was clearly painful. Reina watched him, a strange and unfamiliar pang of empathy stirring within her. She saw not the Mafia boss, not the fearsome owner, but a man drowning in sorrow. On an impulse she couldn't explain, she picked up the phone to the hotel's 24-hour kitchen. She ordered a pot of their finest Gyokuro green tea, a rare, expensive blend known for its calming properties, and instructed the server to deliver it to Mr. Kwan's table with no note. A few minutes later, a server placed the delicate porcelain pot and cup on the small table beside his armchair. Kwan blinked, his focus returning from whatever distant shore it had been on. He looked at the tea, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He glanced toward the kitchen, then his gaze swung to the front desk, finding her. Reina kept her expression neutral, pretending to be absorbed in her computer screen, but she could feel the intensity of his stare. She risked a glance. He was looking directly at her. He didn't smile. His face remained a carved mask, but he lifted his chin in a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of understanding. In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted again, from watcher and watch to something far more complex and dangerous. He had seen her. Not the competent clerk, not the defiant woman, but the person who had recognized his pain and offered a small, quiet gesture of comfort. It was a crack in his armor and a crack in hers, a shared moment of humanity in their Cold War. And she knew, with a sinking feeling, that it bound her to him more tightly than any threat ever could. The fragile truce established by a pot of tea was shattered a week later. Reina's shift ended, the gray light of dawn filtering into the lobby. Kwan had already departed in his silent sedan, leaving a void in the room that felt larger than his physical presence. Reina gathered her things, the exhaustion of the night settling deep into her bones. She walked out of the revolving doors and headed for the bus stop a block away, the familiar end to her surreal nights. She was halfway down the block when a dark van, its windows tinted to an opaque black, screeched to a halt beside her, cutting her off. Two men jumped out from the side door before it had even stopped moving. Her heart leaped into her throat. This was not Kwan's clinical efficiency. This was brutal and sloppy. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She turned to run, but they were too fast. One grabbed her arm, his grip like a vice. Then, from the direction of the hotel, came the roar of a powerful engine. Kwan's black sedan appeared as if from nowhere, a wraith of steel and vengeance. It didn't slow down. It slammed directly into the side of the van with a deafening crunch of metal. The impact threw the man holding her off balance. Before he could recover, the doors of Kwan's car flew open and his men were out, moving with the silent, coordinated lethality of a wolf pack. It was over in less than 30 seconds. A blur of motion, a few muffled sounds, and then silence. The two men were neutralized, disabled on the pavement, and being hauled away by Kwan's people. Kwan Jinwoo himself emerged from the driver's side. He hadn't waited for a chauffeur. He had driven himself. He walked toward her, his face a pale, taut mask of absolute fury. There was no coldness now, only a white-hot rage that seemed to vibrate in the air around him. He ignored his men, ignored the crumpled vehicles. His entire focus was on her. He stopped a foot in front of her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He scanned her from head to toe, his eyes checking for any injury. He didn't ask if she was all right. The question was beneath the sheer magnitude of his anger. "You will not be going home," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. It was not a request. It was an imperial decree. He took her by the elbow, his grip firm but not painful, and steered her back toward the hotel. The morning sun was rising, casting long shadows on the street, but it felt as if they were walking back into the night. He led her past the shocked valets, through the lobby, where Mr. Davies looked as if he might faint, and into his private elevator, the one operated by a special key. As the brass doors slid shut, sealing them in the small, silent space, Raina finally found her voice. She could scream. She could fight. She could demand to be let go. Every instinct of her old life, the life of rules and policies, told her to resist. But she looked at his face. Beneath the terrifying rage, she saw something else, something she had only glimpsed once before. A raw, aching vulnerability. It was fear. He had been afraid of losing her. The elevator ascended smoothly, carrying her away from everything she had ever known. And in the silent, gilded cage, looking at the man whose world was about to swallow hers whole, Raina did the one thing she never thought she would. She nodded. It was a quiet surrender, but it was also a choice. She was no longer just his observer or his prisoner. In that moment of shared violence and unspoken fear, she had become his accomplice. The doors opened directly into the penthouse suite, a sprawling expanse of glass and steel overlooking the entire city, and she stepped out into her new life.